If someone's like, if you don't make a fourth aliyah, I'm telling you, my two brothers will never speak to each other again. In that case, you can add aliyot.
Does that mean you can add infinitely?
There is no concrete limit. Once you can add, theoretically, you could have 900 aliyahs.
Hi, and welcome to Responsa Radio, where you ask and we answer questions of Jewish law in modern times. I'm Rabbi Avi Killip, Executive Vice President at Hadar, here with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, a center for Jewish learning and community building based in New York City. You can check us out and learn more at hadar.org. We are going to explore a question today that will be in the realm of ritual. And I think it's a fun question in part because it's a we want more question as opposed to can I get out of something question. The questioner writes, I'm starting an adult B'nai Mitzvah program this year and will be holding a Shabbat morning service for the students in the program. I have 12 students participating and I'm trying to figure out a way to give them each an individual aliyah. I know there is a divide, I'm hoping this is pun intended, on the issue of adding aliyot to the Torah reading. So I'm wondering if you have guidance for me on how to approach this. If this is allowed, would you repeat an aliyah or divide the aliyot into smaller portions? And if so, how?
Okay.
Are there other contexts where you want more aliyot?
Oh, I would say there's a lot. There's cases where you have two bar mitzvahs that fall out on the same Shabbat and people have lots of relatives that they want to honor. Or sometimes you have a family of Kohanim and you're in a community that's really not going to budge on that way of dividing up the aliyot, and it's difficult to justify doing that on Shabbat morning often anyway. So you want to add other aliyot that maybe Kohanim can take. There's any number of reasons why you might want to do this. I'll give you another context. Sometimes in some places, they auction off the aliyot for money.
More aliyot, more dollars.
There you go. So there's any number of motivations. Actually, even just in this brief review of different possibilities, I think it's interesting to think about the different pressures. And it's a sort of larger question about ritual. When are rituals things that kind of exist and people come in and are assigned a role to make them possible? And when are we kind of leveraging a ritual in order to meet someone's needs to have some kind of public sacred moment? This is sort of I've got 12 students in the Adult B'nai Mitzvah program. It's I'm constructing a program. It's around these people having an aliyah, and I don't know if they're reading Torah also, but there's a sense of the ritual is coming to meet them, right, in some way. Sometimes you have things that are more on the other side of, oh, I need actually to draw these people in to do something, whether or not they want to, etc.
Yeah, I think about that as life cycle versus year cycle, and whether or not the Shabbat morning service is a year cycle moment, right? This is the Parsha we're reading because that's the Parsha this week, or whether or not that Torah reading is a life cycle moment, it is a vehicle for celebrating, for naming a baby, for acknowledging a bar mitzvah, for celebrating an ufruf. Is it in service of the life cycle or is it an aspect of the year cycle? It is, of course, both. But it's sort of which do you lean into?
Right. You can have more extremes. There's a Reform synagogue in Tel Aviv, which is famous for running 4 bar mitzvahs a week. And they have 4 Shabbat services that run over the course of the day just to basically accommodate the different groups of people that want to come in and do this. So that's sort of the extreme of the whole service is being convened for that purpose. And they're even adding other ones. And then there's other ones where, exactly, as you say, no, we're just trying to read the Parsha this morning and maybe we have some other reasons we need to add aliyot. And we'll talk about some of how that might come up.
All right, great. Take us in.
Well, this is a great one. This is one of our episodes, I feel where there will, of course, be some differences of opinion. But also there's a little more of an answer on some of
yeah?
the core facts here. The Mishnah in Megillah lays out the rules for the numbers of aliyot. So here's what it says. I'm actually going to just sort of say out more or less what it says, and then I'm going to have a syntactic question for you at the end, how you would read it.
I'm ready.
On Monday and Thursday mornings, as well as at Shabbat mincha, you read 3 aliyot, but you may not add to the 3. No more than 3. On Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, you read 4 aliyot, and you may not add to them. On Yom Tov, you read 5. On Yom Kippur, you read 6. On Shabbat, you read 7. You may add to them. Okay, that's the end. So on a simple level, before we get to the adding, you got a pretty simple hierarchy. Weekdays and Shabbat Mincha, 3. Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, which are days when you're allowed to work and, at least within some measure, sort of go about doing some degree of normal business. And they have a Korban Musaf. They had an extra special sacrifice that was offered in the temple. Those get 4 days that meet that criteria. And then Yom Tov 5, Yom Kippur 6, Shabbat 7.
Yeah, I mean, instinctively, it feels like you're going up in holiness, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, Oneg Shabbos, we love Shabbat, we get the most number of aliyot. Regular day, chol, we get the least number. The middle is sort of like a stepping up in our holiness and our, each one is an extra gift that we get to savor. That's my instinct about this.
Yeah, okay, good. I think that sounds right. Of course, Shabbat Mincha is a little bit of a fly in the ointment here because Shabbat Mincha is on Shabbat. It's a very holy day.
Right, it feels like it should be more like a Chol HaMoed category.
Maybe it should just be 7, maybe every time you read. So there's a little bit of a question there of why that's less. That might be the one that's not quite like the others. Okay, and now let me ask you this. On Yom Tov 5, on Yom Kippur 6, on Shabbat 7, but you may add to them. Is the phrase, but you may add to them there, referring to all 3 of those, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur, and Shabbat, or only to the last one in the list, Shabbat?
Yeah. My instinct is that it's actually a tack onto the Shabbat, that it's a part of that last couplet, as opposed to that it's about all 3.
Okay, great. So this is the fundamental medieval debate. And as usual, when you're interpreting the syntax of a line, you are also interpreting its scope, right? What does this permission to add apply to? Which cases does it apply? And that's inextricably bound up with what do you think the regulation is about? So let's start with the position that disagrees with you, and then we'll go to the one that agrees with you. The first position is it applies to the whole line. On Yom Tov 5, on Yom Kippur 6, on Shabbat 7, but you may add to them all of those. And on some level, the syntactic argument for that would be, well, it said you can't add to them separately for Monday and Thursday, separately for Rosh Chodesh and the others, and it didn't then repeat that for Yom Tov and Yom Kippur, so it must be covering the whole line. This is how the Rambam rules it in terms of policy, which means you're allowed to add aliyot on Yom Tov morning, on Yom Kippur morning, and on Shabbat morning. So let's say you needed this adult bat mitzvah, let's say was happening on Yom Tov morning. You could make the 5 aliyot you would normally read into 12.
Yeah.
And that would be fine according to the Rambam. Rashi explains why is that the scope? Because the reason you're not allowed to add aliyot normally is people have to go to work.
Right.
It's too long.
Interesting.
And therefore, on any day where people aren't going to work, shouldn't be going to work, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur, and Shabbat all being in that category, do whatever you want. So even if the base requirement for Yom Tov is 5, because it's a less holy day than Shabbat, it doesn't really matter if you add to it, because the only reason you couldn't add in the first place is Rashi says, Shelo yikshe latzibur. It'll be a pain in the neck for the community. Mm-hmm. No one's going anywhere on those days.
This is why we have bar mitzvahs on Shabbat. Right? So
That's right.
People cannot sit there looking at their watch. They've got nowhere to go. But I have a follow-up question. Doesn't this fall apart with Shabbat Mincha also?
Excellent point. So Rashi's already aware of that, and he's like, and Shabbat Mincha. So, but that's getting close to dark. And basically, if it goes on too long, you'll run over the end of Shabbat, and you won't be able to get back to all the chores that you need to do. So that's interesting, and maybe is also an explanation of why Shabbat Mincha was 3 in the first place. You want to keep things tight as you get to the end of Shabbat. Okay, so that's one possibility. This is all about sort of when people have the freedom and the mental space to settle into a prolonged ritual. And on any day where that's the case, you can add in as much as you want. Okay, the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim of Gerona, reads the way you initially read it, which is the last phrase applies only to Shabbat. And aside from the fact that, well, structurally, linguistically, you could argue this or that, he basically says, what's the point of giving the different numbers that signify the sanctity of the day if you're going to blur them by adding more? Like if it's a Yom Tov morning and I add 2 additional things, well, haven't I made it seem like Shabbat, and haven't I cheapened Shabbat or elevated Yom Tov? So he says the only time you can add is when you're statutorily at the max already.
Right. No one will say, but it's 12, therefore it's Hanukkah or something.
Exactly.
Right.
So since Shabbat is the top rung, you can keep going up. It doesn't matter. But the other ones, you'll occlude the difference between these days. And actually, the aliyah numbers are very important for signifying what kind of day this is. So the only thing that's acceptable is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or more. So pretty much this breaks down as a baseline practice, Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, which is to say, the Rambam and then later the Sfaradim rule that you can add aliyot on Yom Tov, on Yom Kippur. It doesn't matter, any day where you're not working. And the Ashkenazim, the Ramah, follow the position of the Ran and say only on Shabbat should you really add aliyot. Now, there's some other lingering concern here, which is there are some people who are kind of hesitant to doing this at all. Even the view that says, well, we follow the Ran, on Shabbat it should be fine. Like we never add aliyot, except on Shabbat it should be fine. There are 2 sources of nervousness about it with some authorities. One is, well, when they're talking about adding extra aliyot in the time of the Mishnah, it's under a different regime of what Torah reading looks like. First of all, the person getting the aliyah is reading Torah. It's not divided into 2 parts. But second, more important, the way it would work is the person who has the first aliyah says the opening bracha, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim. And the person who has the last aliyah says the closing bracha, Asher Natan Lanu Torat Emet. And no one in the middle says any bracha at all. And the first person doesn't say a closing bracha, and the last person doesn't say an opening bracha.
So then what's the distinction that allows you to know you're moving from one to the other? It's just...
A new person comes up and reads.
So the question actually is, how many readers are there? Because we now have the same reader read the whole parsha.
That's right.
So
or we break it up on
reader,
a different axis.
Does that mean that in the time of the Mishnah, you had to have 7 people who read on a Shabbat morning?
Yes, ideally you do. And actually one text that talks about this will say, if you're in a synagogue where there's only one person who knows how to read Torah, they simply get up, sit down 7 times. Because you still have to sort of act out the fact that there are 7 parts, but the aliyah is reading.
Yeah.
But the idea is we have a very different system now where it used to be when they added another aliyah, it meant, okay, someone else is going to come up and read, but essentially the structure of brachot remains the same. Today, if you add an aliyah, you're saying God's name and a blessing 2 more times for each person that does it.
Right. The ancient version makes me think of like a Megillah reading, right? The way that we do Megillah reading.
Exactly
right. And sometimes
right.
one person reads a chapter and sometimes 3 people divide up the chapter.
Exactly right. And the same structure of the opening person says the opening bracha. Then there's different practices of who says the final one at the end, but it's like a parentheses of brachot, as opposed to each person who comes up gets their own liturgical unit.
So there's a lot more at stake here when you live in a world where how you use God's name is very important.
For the most part, I will say this does not shut down the practice or possibility of adding aliyot, but it puts a thumb on the scale for some people of, we only do that when we're really feeling stuck.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing which gets a lot more weight is taking seriously the whole reason that we don't have Hosafot, these added aliyot, for sure on the weekday and Rosh Chodesh and all of that, which is, even if people aren't working, it's annoying. That is to say, it's annoying to the community to feel like Torah reading is going to go on and on and on.
Is that necessarily irrelevant on Shabbat? And also the sort of frame of once you're at 7, you can add. Does that mean you can add infinitely?
Good. So that's where I would say to you, statutorily, as it were, there is no concrete limit. Once you can add, theoretically, you could have 900 aliyahs. That's where, though, everyone would agree that at a certain point, this becomes absurd and an intolerable burden on the community. And some people just scale that down to adding even 1, right? If you don't have to, or certainly adding more than 3 or 4 or something of that nature.
Before we get back into this episode, I want to ask for your help. Hadar depends on listeners like you to keep this podcast on the airwaves and sustain our programs for Jewish life and learning. From now until December 31st, every dollar you give will be matched. This is the perfect time to make a tax-deductible gift. If you love this podcast and you value Torah content from Hadar, please make a donation that will be doubled at hadar.org/donate. Thank you. We've been talking about it, like how much can I subdivide the aliyot that are there? You obviously can't subdivide one parsha 800 times. So it sounds like this is also open to the possibility of adding other extra aliyot from other places.
Okay, so this goes to then the question, assuming that you can justify hosafot, these added aliyot, in a basic way, it's going to be a little bit of a common sense judgment call of what is the balanced way to have the right number, right? That's happening. And then, as you point out, you're going to have to make some kind of judgment of how to break it up. So in a simple way, the best case scenario, it's Shabbat morning. You're doing the full Torah reading. It's pretty long. It can be broken into any number of smaller subunits. So you simply divide some of the longer aliyot into smaller units and thereby get more mileage out of them. There are some guidelines you have to follow when doing that. Number 1, you are not supposed to add on a bad note. You shouldn't pick a pasuk, a verse that is saying something like totally harsh and terrible. There are a couple parshiot that end that way because there's just a certain major blocks in the Torah that end with something harsh.
We don't go out of our way to create that feeling.
We don't go out of our way to create that. Mesayimim b'davar tov. You try to end an aliyah on a good note, which is why you'll notice a lot of times in various parshiot, an aliyah will kind of end almost mid-thought. Like if you were translating it, it would be mid-paragraph. But it's the only nice thing. Some note of triumph or so that you'll know that I am God, right? Or something like that. So that's one guideline. Another guideline is you're never allowed to end an aliyah within 1 or 2 verses of a natural break in the Torah, whether a ptucha or a stuma, the things in the actual scroll where there's a big space either to the end of the line or in the middle of the line. You've got to either end at one of those breaks or 3 or more verses away from a break like that. Another guideline here, when you have a double parsha, right? Sometimes some of those parshiyot that get read together, Matot Maseh, Vayakel Pekude, the 4th aliyah is supposed to be the bridge aliyah that takes you from one parsha to the next. So you should not be adding hosafot in the first parsha, because that'll mess up the idea that, well, I know there's 7 aliyot, and then the 4th aliyah is the middle aliyah. It gives equal honor, as it were, to both parshiyot. And if you see, you look at all the doubles, Revi'i is always the bridge aliyah, and it's set up that way. So those are kind of the basic things that you do when you're just subdividing and picking the right place. Now, sometimes, what happens if you don't have enough verses? This could either happen when you want to have 900 additional aliyahs that morning, or sometimes the Torah reading is too short, like on Rosh Chodesh. On Rosh Chodesh morning, there is no way, without violating the rules that I just said to you, to divide up the Rosh Chodesh Torah reading that's about the day of Rosh Chodesh and the regular offering into 4 parts equally without overlap. And so what you actually do there is you backtrack 1 verse in order to read something you already read again to get the minimum amount of sort of 3-verse chunks in. Sometimes it's the most extreme where you actually read the same thing over and over, because if you're on a Torah reading that's about like a specific day of a holiday. So for instance, Chol HaMoed, okay? Chol HaMoed Sukkot. There's like these short 3-4 verse paragraphs for each specific day.
Right.
So in the diaspora, we're like, well, we'll read yesterday's and today's and then tomorrow's, and then we'll loop back to yesterday's and today's and read them together. But that's in part because we're playing with the fact that, we have these 2 days of Yom Tov and some doubt about calendars and dates. So if you're really stuck, essentially, like Sfaradim do that more liberally than Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim will basically only repeat when you have to. There's no other choice. A time where you see this happen all the time, you don't think about it, is the maftir aliyah on Shabbat morning, when basically the person reading the haftarah is supposed to read something from the Torah before they do the haftarah. But there's also a tradition that maybe they shouldn't count towards the main 7 aliyot of the parsha. So you want to read the whole parsha in 7 parts, but then this person should read some of the Torah, so you just read the last 3 verses usually again. That's an example of, I have no choice, there's nothing I can do given the other regulations, so I'll repeat. So I would say in terms of the guideline here, in terms of someone splitting this up, if you need to do it, the technical way is you got to look for those breakpoints. And if there's for some reason no way you can find a breakpoint, you might have to do some repeating. Worth getting someone on the phone or however to go over it if you're uncertain, to make sure to do it. But I want to say another thing here about just going back to the question. It sounds like the questioner has in mind not only the 12 people and the ceremony that they want to do, but also there's some kind of congregational setting where this is known as an event or something like that. But if not, I would emphasize that that's actually quite important, which is to say, you don't want to ambush someone thinking they're showing up for a normal Torah reading without some sense of, hey, we're going to be dividing it into 12 parts this morning.
Yeah.
You can't control who walks in off the street and you didn't know, but that notion of lo yikshel hatzibur, don't sort of suddenly catch people unawares with a very long Torah reading. is, I think, a part of the sensitivity to this dynamic as well.
And would that push you in a direction of, once you have 14 people, do 7 this week and 7 next week? Is there some sort of upper limit of this principle where you would say, like, if it feels ridiculous, then don't do it?
Right. So this really goes back to the question of how much does the ritual come to the person and how much does the person come to the ritual, which to me is like an interesting question. How much do we sort of bend and construct those ritual spaces to fit the needs of the people who are going to participate, as opposed to, well, they're playing a critical role in making it happen. I'll give you one last dimension of this area of halacha, and I think through it, maybe we can get a little bit of an insight as to the struggle around this. So you can imagine it's all well and good to say you should only be adding extra aliyot on Shabbat morning. You can never do that on a weekday morning. I think you can imagine some situations where it might be difficult, or it might feel like there is pressure to have more than 3 aliyot on a weekday morning. We have an example of this, the Riva, who was an early German authority in the Middle Ages. He confronts a case where there are 2 weddings in his community that are happening on a Thursday night. Mm-hmm. And it is a very strong tradition in his community, and still in different forms until today, that the groom, in his context, gets an aliyah at the Torah reading right before his wedding.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a way of bringing the proof. It's the auspiciousness of the Torah into your new chapter of life. And basically, there were, in his case, actually 3 people getting married on that Thursday. 1 was a Kohen, 2 were Yisraelim. So the Kohen and the Yisrael, no problem. He gives one aliyah number 1 and the other aliyah number 3, and the second aliyah goes to some Levi. But what about the other groom?
So sad for him.
So he's like, no, I can make a hosafah. I can add a 4th aliyah to give to this guy. Why? Because we have another context in the Talmud that getting married is like your own personal Yom Tov.
I love it.
So we can add aliyot on Yom Tov, right, for this person.
Yeah.
Now, what's amazing is, so this is a real, like, the ritual's coming to meet the person, right? Like it's their wedding and this affects the rules. The Ramah, when he's codifying things, says, yeah, you can do that for 2 weddings. You can also do it. Now he's like, well, once you open that up, you can do it for a bris. Exactly. Yeah. 2 people who have a bris that day, that's also like a Yom Tov for them. And therefore, you can do both of those. The backlash to this later is fast and furious, which is amazing. So you've got Rav Yosef Karo in his work, The Bet HaKabayit on the Beit Yosef, who says, absolutely not. We don't do this. Rav Ovadia Yosef, much later, speaking for Sfaradim, says, absolutely not. Sfaradim can never do this. This is some whacked out Ashkenazi leniency. You may not do it. And then, interestingly, though, the Mishnah Brura, the great Ashkenazi codifier and posek at the turn of the 20th century, also says Ashkenazim can't do this either.
Do they give a reason?
Well, this is what I want to sort of talk through. There's a sense of, well, formally, I think the reason they give is, I don't know, the Riva said this, and the Mechaber, Rav Yosef Karo, didn't bring it in the Shulchan Aruch, so maybe not everyone signs on to it. He's the only one that said it. It may be an outlier position. But I have an instinct that part of what's driving them is they actually are resisting this idea that we're going to like manipulate the ritual space to accommodate this idiosyncratic calendar of these people. I can't tell you that for sure, but you see here a real conflict, right? Over, well, what's the thing to do in this space? Right. I don't know how you read it when you hear it.
Right. I don't think of Torah services and weddings being juxtaposed quite in the same way as a bris, right? Like it's like we've all been to a bris where there's the service is right before it. And it can sometimes feel so clear when you're at a bris that this is a chag for the family and not for everybody else, that like for the family, they're like, we'll start when we start.
Right.
And there's no sense of time. And this is we're having a party. And, everyone else in the room is sort of like, I gotta get to work.
Yes.
Okay. Have we been here? Like, is this going to actually start? Because we said, there's like that real sense of the way that time can be a chag for one person and not for the community, and then having to figure out how to navigate that balance.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the most reasonable approach I found to this is in the Aruch HaShulchan, someone we quote with some fair frequency on this show, Rav Yechiel Michael Epstein, who was in Novardok, the Lithuanian, White Russian area, turn of the 20th century. And the Aruch HaShulchan is known for being like a community rabbi with sort of a sense of, yeah, but how's this going to play in the real world? Like the Mishnah Berurah sits there, he comments on things, he looks at all the sources, he's like, this is what I think the law is. But he was basically like a Beit Midrash person who sat around learning all day.
He's the academic.
The Aruch HaShulchan also learns all day, but he has a little more of a sense of responsibility to a community. So he says the following. I really love all parts of this formulation. He says, with respect to adding additional aliyot on the weekday, we've never seen anyone who would do that. Okay. In other words, like that's just not the practice. The Ramah said this, but that was in, 16th century Poland. And speaking to you like 350 years later, I'm telling you, no one does this. And moreover, we don't even do Hosafot on Yom Tov, right? Like we fall in that Ran camp where we only do it on Shabbat. So if you won't do it on Yom Tov, how could you do it on a weekday? So the answer is no, you don't do that. That's point number one. Point number two, he says, okay, but if there's going to be a massive fight, if you're basically going to, it's not about, someone asks you like, hey, could we have 4 aliyahs? Your answer would be like, no, actually we can't do that. But if someone's like, if you don't make a 4th aliyah, I'm telling you, my 2 brothers will never speak to each other again because of the insult of, X, Y, and Z. He says, in that case, I think we can rely on the Ramah. Yeah. And what you should just do to sort of minimize the impact is you have the person who's called up 4th just read the 3rd aliyah again.
Yeah.
Do the repeating. Don't like extend the Torah reading to some other place. Do that. So his point 2 is, I think actually like when push comes to shove, the multivocality of the opinions here can help us avoid fights. And then the third thing he says is, but the minhag for avoiding fights on this is one of them gets an aliyah and one of them gets hagba. And what I love about that third point is there's a sense of sometimes the solution to those conflicts is, oh, what position from the past can I pull out to be more flexible? Sometimes it's actually thinking creatively, maybe there's another honor that could solve this.
I love that sense of saying like, let's expand the scope of the question and see if we can find a different answer.
Right. Now, if the value of Hagba in your community is low, and there's a sense of like, Hagba, they give that to like anyone who just walked in, then this may not solve the problem. But I think having
how much would you pay for a Hagba? That's the question.
That's exactly right.
What's the market rate?
Right. It's exactly right. But what I love about this Aruch HaShulchan, and I think it's a meta element we could take away from this episode, is to say, it's actually important sometimes to understand where has practice gone on something and what's the idea behind it, and to be able to like explain it. Yeah, we don't add aliyot on these days and there's a value behind it. Here's why we do it. We don't have to be apologetic about it. To hold that alongside remembering that there's usually more than one answer to a question, and probably the reason we preserved that other answer was there might be a difficult situation we find ourselves in where we need to rely on that. And be creative. See the other ways that are not necessarily direct takedowns of your existing practice that can get you to that endpoint.
Yeah. And maybe I'll add one last one, which is just the intersection again between the life cycle and the ritual cycle, is to say that part of why you can't give it over entirely to the life cycle is because you're not the only person in the community. There may be a second groom on the same day. There may be 11 other people having their bat mitzvah also today. And we have to actually learn to share that life cycle moment and those aliyot to say like, yeah, it's my bat mitzvah, but it's also your wedding and it's also that baby's opportunity to be named. And we have to figure out how to all do this together. So in that way, even when you're adding more, it might still be pointing us away from the sort of like, it's all about me and my simcha.
Yeah. And so I think when you asked, so would you guide this person to have 6 on one week, 6 on the other? I would say, have an Aruch HaShulchan type of mentality around this, which is to say, well, actually, you're within your rights, in this case, to have 12 aliyot on Shabbat. No one really denies that, but you want to make sure the community is sort of kept apprised of it. I don't know. Could you split it into 6? I think that would probably depend on the nature of the process these people have been through or whether that feels viable. Will that lead to tension? Will it be annoying to the community to say, I was willing to have 1 week that was taken up by this, but I actually don't want 2 weeks? Or the other way, think it through. And actually, depending on what the factors are, that'll lead you to what makes the most sense.
Yeah. I'll just end by giving sort of a note of appreciation for adult b'nai mitzvah as a ritual. I think it can be hard to see sometimes from the outside how meaningful that process and that ritual can be for the people experiencing it. I know my mom did an adult bat mitzvah when I was growing up. It was incredibly important to her, I think, and to our family and to the community. So I just sort of want to end on a note of like, kol hakavod and good for you to the people who participate in that kind of exercise. And if it's something that you haven't done, but you didn't have an opportunity when you were a child and it seems interesting to you, like it's worth looking into because it can be very meaningful.
Mazal tov.
Thanks.
There's something else to say. Ain't hardly scratched the surface yet of what they're gonna pay me, but I just need bare minimum. Well, that's a maximum lie. Want $100 billion and a castle in the sky. Maybe along with
Have a halachic question you'd like answered on the show? Email us at responsa@hadar.org. Responsa Radio is a project of the Hadar Institute. Thanks to Chana Kupetz and Jeremy Tabick for producing this podcast and to David Khabinsky for recording and editing this episode.
maybe it's time I reconsider my American dream.